It wasn't holy, it wasn't Roman, and it certainly wasn't much of an empire, but it lasted for 1,000 years. What exactly was the Holy Roman Empire? Chaotic jigsaw of kings, bishops, rival crowns, and very tired peasants. This is the full, messy story you were never told in school, gently unwrapped to help you drift off. Press play, settle under your blanket, and let the rise and fall of emperors and popes slowly rock you to sleep. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so your dreams are always filled with cozy history. You begin at the edges of an old world that refuses to die in the wake of a partition that did not settle much. In 843, the Treaty of Verdun divided the Carolingian realms among the grandsons of Charlemagne, yielding West Francia, Middle Francia, and East Francia. The names were practical, almost geographical labels for the political reality of royal inheritance. Yet they had a way of hardening into identity. East Francia, the one you will follow, looked like a composite of lands with different textures. Saxony, Franconia, Bavaria, Swabia, and the borderlands of Lotharingia. The countryside was a patchwork of open fields and forest strips, with waterways acting as arteries more reliable than the roads that jolted carts and travelers. If you were there, you would feel the political weight of the local, for the king's power lay not in fixed offices, but in his ability to travel, to convene assemblies, to give and withhold gifts. After Verdun, kingship in East Francia lived through itinerancy rather than palaces. A royal court moved with its king, and the king moved because he had to, without a centralized treasury to supply a capital. The king lived off royal estates, called the fiscs, scattered through the duchies. These estates were not merely farms, but nodes in a network of loyalty. When the king came, estate managers hurried to gather renders, grain, pigs, wine, honey, horses, textiles. Hospitality was politics. A feast was a contract in meat and bread. At each stop, the king held court, adjudicated disputes, approved charters, and negotiated with dukes and bishops who could keep distant marches secure. It was not a bureaucracy, but a carousel, and the rhythm of the realm measured itself against the hooves of royal horses and the feet of messengers. Duchies were large and powerful because they were pragmatic. Saxony had its own warrior elite. Franconia, its great families. Bavaria, its long frontier with Slavic peoples and the remnants of Avar lands. Swabia, its rich monasteries and traders connecting to the Alps. The dukes were not merely administrators. They were guardians of whole regions whose defense depended on mustering men in the proper season and ensuring that oaths meant something when trouble came. Oaths were not symbolic. They were performative, the glue of obligation renewed in public, and sealed by relics that no one wanted to offend. If you picture a duke, do not picture a desk. Picture a patron with halls full of retainers, a chapel with jewel-studded books, and a stable whose contents meant something in war. In this landscape, kingship could not simply be inherited. It had to be accepted, and therefore it had to be demonstrated. After the end of the direct Carolingian line in East Francia, new hands took the scepter. In 919, Henry the Fowler, Duke of Saxony, became king, elected by powerful nobles who imagined the title as a partnership. He was famous for not running to be crowned, but for being almost reluctant, preferring a day's work of hawking to the anxious ceremonies of kingship. The story is too neat to be entirely literal, but it conveys a truth. A king had to be a realistic manager of expectations. Henry owed his crown to consent and cemented it by careful, patient work, securing borders, exacting tribute from neighboring peoples, and building a system of fortified places, burhs or burgs, that would hold men and stores and act as magnets of local defense. Those fortifications mattered less for grand castles and more for distributed resilience. A ring of earthworks and towers, stocked with a market and a garrison, could absorb the shock of raids that no field army could always intercept in time. Markets mattered because soldiers needed supply, and supply needed exchange. Fortified places meant weekly rhythms, markets on set days, tolls collected at gates, local administrators to count and record. In their shadow, older habits ramified into new ones. Farmers would drive pigs to panage in oak woods, but merchants would gather to trade cloth and salt. Every year, the king visited some of these strongpoints, heard the petitions of men who remembered the Carolingians but lived in a set of customs that felt more tangible and recent. Stability was not a masterpiece. It was an accumulation of small buttresses. Henry's son, Otto I, later called the Great, inherited a realm that needed assertion. It was not enough to be elected. Rivals had to be subdued, and those who had supported the election expected returns. Otto faced rebellions, some from his own kin, and the management of kindred was an essential, boring, draining part of early medieval politics. Brothers and half-brothers could be both assets and threats, and the distribution of estates to keep them loyal had to be recalibrated. Whenever an inheritance plan changed, if you were a notary writing a royal diploma in these years, your work required careful listing of gifts, precise phrases, place names, the legal formulae that turned a verbal gift in a hall into a recognized right across the land. Lines of Latin. Text with standardized clauses were the cables that held together the ship, even as real cables moored boats bringing goods to market towns. The story of Otto is often told with one fixed point: the Battle of Lechfeld in 955, where a Magyar raiding force was defeated near Augsburg. The battle was a pivot because it turned back a pattern of anxiety. Magyar raids had struck deep into lands that could not rely on permanent garrisons. The best defense was prediction, speed, and local fortification. Lechfeld was not just a victory. It was a declaration that the frontier would hold, a signal that the inner arrangements of the realm could shift from contingency to something resembling planning. After Lechfeld, monasteries and bishoprics could breathe more easily. Merchants contemplated routes with less dread of interruption. Frontier marchés, strips of land organized for defense under margraves, could be made into instruments of expansion and conversion rather than mere buffers, with safer borders. Otto had room to pursue a distinctly Saxon strategy: the close partnership with the church. This was not piety as ornament. It was administration. Great bishops doubled as princely figures, with lands, courts, and menads. Their positions, unlike a duchy, were not hereditary in the same way. And a king could influence appointments, ensuring that a bishop owed his seat to the crown. This is sometimes called the Ottonian church system, but you can think of it more plainly as a solution to the problem of continuity, where a duke might pass lands to a relative with independent ambitions. A bishop's successor could be chosen with royal input, renewing the chain of dependence. Cathedrals were places of prayer and governance. Their domes and towers announced to a countryside that this was a node where law was spoken and recorded. Stores were held, and the past was archived in charters kept in Ar Maria as Otto's reign lengthened. The horizon widened to Italy, that complicated corridor of riches and crowns. The notion of reviving Empire Roman in name, Christian in imagination, drew him across the Alps. In 962, he was crowned emperor, not in the old sense of a universal ruler, but in a way that gave his kingship an extra layer of sacral authority. The imperial title did not produce soldiers or grain by itself, but it had diplomatic gravity, and it played well in the economy of legitimacy. Monasteries illuminated manuscripts that showed rulers touching relics and receiving crowns. Goldsmiths made processional crosses. Mints struck coins with names that traveled. For people in placements distant from Rome, Empire arrived as iconography and as the memory of a ceremonial day told and retold. In churches where the liturgy now included prayers for the emperor by name, life under the early emperors did not feel like a continuous crisis. It felt like a hard, cycling normal. In the countryside, the heavy plow was becoming more common in clay-rich soils, its iron share biting deeper, turning heavy earth that lighter scratch plows could not handle. Where the terrain allowed, the open field system made sense. Strips of land in large fields, a complex of holdings scattered so that bad luck or poor soil in one place did not ruin a peasant entirely. The village community coordinated fallow and sowing, and this coordination was not just custom, it was survival. Rents took the form of labor days on the Lord's domain. Produce in kind, or later, sometimes money, where markets were frequent. On the edges of woods, charcoal burners tended slow fires under mounded earth. In valleys, millers watched water wheels that saved hours of back-breaking grinding. If you walked through a monastic grange, you would see tally sticks and storage, bins, ledgers in neat hands, and a rhythm set by bells that carved the day into offices and work. The royal itinerary threaded all these worlds. A king traveling with his retinue could be a burden, but it was also a focus. Preparations began weeks in advance on estates scheduled to host the court. Pigs were slaughtered and salted, ale brewed in large tons. Cellars checked for wine, and fodder cut for horses. Royal clerks brought chests of wax tablets and parchments, seals, and ribbons. Bishops arrived with entourages. Dukes sent emissaries if they could not come in person. Disputes that had simmered for months appeared before the king. He heard cases about boundaries, inheritance, and rights to collect tolls. Witnesses swore oaths on relics. Settlements were recorded. Sometimes a market fair was proclaimed to coincide with the visit, attracting merchants with the promise of special protections and an audience for goods from distant regions: salt from the mines, furs from the north, fine cloth from Lombardy. Even in these mundane scenes, you can feel how a political order was made from repetition. Laws were not uniform everywhere. Local custom mattered. Yet the king's presence pushed toward common forms. Measurement standards were discussed. Coinage was sometimes reformed. Adulteration of goods was punished in the marketplace. The church served as a school for administration. Scriptoria trained clerks who would become the notaries and advisors of dukes and kings. Monasteries like Corvey, Fulda, and Reichenau were repositories of both prayer and literacy. A charter's blunt phrases carried the weight of memory. Anyone who had seen falsifications knew how crucial it was to fix a formula, use a standard, seal, and keep copies. Archivists mattered because, in disputes decades later, the survival of a single parchment could tilt a verdict. The empire that seemed to be taking shape was not a machine, but a body with many limbs. On the frontiers, margraves tried to extend influence by missionary work and settlement. In the East, contact with Slavic polities produced both conflict and alliance. Tribute could be extracted. Marriages could be arranged. Baptisms might transform neighbors into partners. But every change required logistics. If a new church was planted in a frontier town, someone had to find the masons, the timber, the roofing shingles, or thatch, depending on resources, and the stone if a quarry was close. A priest needed a missal and a lectionary. Someone had to pay the scribe and the illuminator. Bells were expensive and symbolic. When one rang, it sent a message of care as well as control. The labor of empire was thoracic and local, lungs breathing through 1,000 villages. The fashioning of royal authority through the church created opportunities and problems. Gifts to bishoprics and monasteries were not just pious acts, they were investments in reliable partners. But land given was land not easily reclaimed, and immunities privileges exempting ecclesiastical lands from the jurisdiction of lay. Officials could create enclaves where the bishop's men collected dues and guarded gates. When an abbot or a bishop died, the question of succession mattered intensely. Kings had leverage, and they used it, presenting candidates who promised loyalty. In return, bishops contributed to armies and hosted royal courts, lending their cathedrals solemnity to announcements. Yet every guarantee raised the specter of later descent. Memory is sticky. A duke who watched a king appoint a bishop might applaud when it suited him and treat it as overreach when it did not. When Otto's son, Otto II, inherited, he faced the mathematics of ambition in Italy, and the fragility of winds turned into expectations. Imperial ventures across the Alps required men and money, and Italy, with its wealthy cities and layered politics, could both supply and absorb resources. The imperial household expanded its network of friends and clients. But an army's failure or a bad season could unwind connections painfully. In the north, the realm still needed hands and attention, as did the frontier. The defeat in southern Italy in 982 at the hands of a Muslim force near Stilo showed how hard balance could be. The defeat did not collapse the empire, but it rolled back momentum and forced recalculation. In the meantime, peasant families continued to worry about weather, priests about storing grain for the poor, and reeves about collecting rents in a year when yields were lean. Otto III, inheriting as a child after Otto II's death, represents a different note in the melody ideas of renewal, of a consciously Roman Christian empire braided with German and Italian threads. His reign brought gestures heavy with symbolism, the use of ancient Roman spaces for ceremonies, the patronage of scholars who argued that order could proceed from law, and a fascination with the imperial past. For people making soap from rendered fat or hammering nails in a village forge, this high politics may have felt remote. But its crest broke into their lives through decrees that reorganized markets, forbade certain exactions, or proclaimed new festivals. Through roads improved for a royal progress, and through the arrival of fresh saints' relics whose presence could make a church a pilgrimage center, shifting the gravity of a local economy. By the time Henry II closed the Ottonian century, piety and policy had braided still tighter. He was known for close work with the church and for founding bishoprics and monasteries, a pattern that deepened the administrative partnership. At the same time, he contended with the ordinary obstinacy of great men. Dukes who wished to be treated as authors of decisions, counts who wanted their prerogatives recognized, and city elites beginning to discover that their collective wealth gave them leverage. In these tugging motions, you can hear both the strength and the weakness of the order. It could adapt, because so much depended on negotiation. It could struggle, because so much depended on negotiation. And always the calendar mattered. Harvests came, courts met in Advent and Lent, and kings planned their circuits to maximize visibility where disputes were hottest. If you stand back and look at this first phase from Verdun to the early 11th century, the emerging Holy Roman Empire is not a monolith, but a pattern of pathways, royal road and river channel, pilgrimage route and messengers, tracks stitched together by documents, oaths, and the ritual of presence. It is tempting to look ahead and see the tensions already lacquered in place. The power of bishops against the claims of kings, the assertiveness of dukes, the lure and expense of Italy, the habit of itinerancy that doubles as strength and strain. But try to feel it as the people in it did, as a set of habits, fairs, fasts, and visits, all promising steadiness in a world where a late frost could rearrange the year. As Henry II's court kneels under vaulted stone and anointed fingers bless a new foundation, you might wonder, when the balance between kings and bishops is tested, will these careful, ordinary buttresses hold, or will the repairs needed to keep them steady, shake the whole structure more than anyone intends? You step into the quiet between grand events, into the slow work that binds a crown to its people. After the panicked years of incursions and answered raids, after the thunder of Lechfeld and the ceremonial gravity of an imperial coronation. What follows is neither silence nor ease. It is a labor of stitching. If you want to understand how the Saxon kings made something that could be felt as an empire, you do not watch a single field of battle. You follow the king's messengers and the bishop's stewards. You keep the company of abbots and reeves, and you listen for the sound of seals being pressed into hot wax. That faint sizzle as a promise becomes a document, and a document becomes a tool that can compel Dot in the decades after Otto I. Power had to be renewed. In regular patterns, the royal itinerary was the spine of that pattern. Every year was a circuit, known in advance by captains of kitchens and wardens of stables, by the men who counted barrels and those who counted souls. If the court would be in Magdeburg at Martinmas, then wine had to be hauled earlier from the Rhineland. Smoked meats hung in cool cellars, bread ovens arranged for extra loads. Clerks, knowing the stop would attract petitioners, prepared parchment cut from skins selected months before by tanners. Who knew how pliability and thickness would affect the fold of a diploma? These are not romantic details. They are the workings of government. A king who eats while his charters are written is a king whose presence turns grievances into rulings and promises into property. Bishops became the crucial partners because their office could be influenced more reliably than a dukedom. When a bishop died, there followed a period of vacancies and negotiation, during which royal influence mattered decisively. A well-placed prelate had a dual existence: shepherd of souls and manager of lands. His chapter was not an abstraction. It was a community of canons who maintained a library, taught boys their letters and chants, copied legal texts, and met in chapter house to assign tasks. The bishop's courtyards thrummed with the business of the city and its hinterland. A chancery, humming with the steady scratch of quills, turned oral decisions into written ones. A granary's full bins could feed not only the poor in a hungry season, but also the soldiers passing through on a royal summons. The city gates, perhaps newly fortified after the Magyar years, collected tolls in coin and kind, and the bishop's officials, archdeacons, and vicars made their rounds, inspecting altars and oil stocks, admonishing priests whose parishes were drifting into laxity. Because the empire's spine was itinerant, local anchors mattered. Fortified places were not castles in the heroic mold, but thick-walled refuges with timber towers and well-lined ditches. Places where market days drew farmers and craftsmen for trade and gossip, and where a small garrison maintained the art of readiness. The practice of maintaining a garrison is a portrait of ordinary endurance. Fletchers bundling arrows in spare hours. Smiths fashioning rivets for mail that needed constant mending. Stable boys brushing mud from hooves and rubbing down tired horses. In such places, the crown's agents announced the bantha power to command freemen to muster, to build, to keep watch. Violations of the ban meant fines paid painfully in coin or livestock, but the fines were predictable, and predictability is the first mercy of law. The Ottonian alliance with the church made administration denser without making it uniform. Royal patronage endowed monasteries and bishoprics with lands that formed little archipelagos of authority in seas of ordinary lordship. Those islands had their own rhythms. The monastery bell divided day and night into canonical hours, matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline, and the intervals between prayers were filled with work. Fields worked by monastic laborers were organized with care. Strips assigned, rotations observed, ditches cleared, hedges mended at the right season. A cellarer kept inventories. How many measures of grain were in the western granary? How many wheels of cheese in the cool room? How many hams hung in smokehouses? How much ale in the tuns? The sacrist counted candles and incense, checked the reliquaries for damage, and kept an eye on the silver vessels. Not for avarice, but for readiness. Liturgical order was a form of social order. and the hospitalier, tasked with hospitality, directed the steady traffic of travelers and the poor, recording costs that would be charged to royal visits or borne as alms. None of this eliminated conflict. Great duchies remained powerful and jealous of encroachment. Saxony itself, the heartland of the royal house, kept a memory of its own dignity that could bristle when the king favored a bishop too much. From Qualic Franconia had its leading families, and their succession politics could ripple beyond their borders. Bavaria, guarding access to the Danube and to lands eastward, bargained its loyalty through marriages and promises, not through meekness. Swabia's monasteries were rich, but its nobles were too. And the balancing of their interests was not a matter of principle, but of patient arithmetic. Rewards had to be distributed, and every grant gave birth to expectations for the next season. Inside this arithmetic, women of the royal household worked with a steadiness that seems to vanish behind titles, unless you trace their intercessions in charters. Empress Adelaide, married to Otto I, appears not as ornament but as advocate. Petitions passed through her hands, and her presence in negotiations gave an emotional ballast to agreements. Later, Theophanu, the Byzantine-born wife of Otto II and mother regent for Otto III, left marks on seals and diplomas, her stylized profile declaring a claim of authority that was not feigned. The regency under Theophanu and then under Adelaide after Theophanu's death was a demonstration that the empire's machinery could keep its rhythm even when a child was king. The royal seal continued to fall with a ceremonial thump onto warm wax, and the messengers continued to ride. Across the realm, coins passed through hands rough and soft, proof that distance could be bridged by a name pressed into metal. Mints. In cities like Cologne, Regensburg, Mainz, and Magdeburg produced deniers and pfennigs, their silver content always subject to scrutiny and complaint. When a reform adjusted weight or purity, merchants and market judges needed to relearn equivalents, and scribes in towns copied out tables of conversion that made life a bit easier for men who sold fish and women who spun wool. Weights and measures were shy animals. They refused to be uniform across the empire, but royal edicts tugged them near. Market law specified where scales had to stand, who could inspect them, and what fines followed short measure. Bakers who underweighted loaves were warned, then fined, because bread was not mere commerce. It was the basic trust between townspeople and their own daily work to keep spans under control. The empire's rulers multiplied points of contact. Sembli's Hoftage, royal courts punctuated the year. Gaslar, Quedlinburg, Merseburg, Ingelheim. Pavia, over the Alps, each had its ceremonial setting, a hall big enough for a congregation of great men. An attached chapel where the liturgy could enfold the politics in prayers. On certain feasts, Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, kings and emperors preferred prominent venues because crowd and ritual magnified prestige. You'll find in the records the precise language of convocation letters and the enumeration of attendees. The pledges captured in formulae that grew familiar: to hold faith, to keep the peace, to follow the ban when proclaimed. When the king sat in judgment, disputes that had bumped along at local levels could be settled with finality, lest they were not. For finality depends upon memory and enforcement, and both are human. The Ottonian taste for thinking with the church shaped a suture between religious reform and governance. This was the age when monastic communities looked again at the rule of Saint Benedict and experimented with stricter observance. Sometimes inspired by the Gors and Cluniac movements, such reforms altered the quality of administration because they created houses where discipline could be exported. A daughter house carries not only the rule, but a style of keeping books, of storing grain, of service to travelers. Cathedrals, for their part, developed schools that trained not only clergy, but clerks for secular administration. In the memory of teachers like Gerbert of Aurillac, who would become Pope Sylvester II under Otto III, you sense how the empire's intellectual spine stiffened, not toward speculation, but toward calculate and measure, toward better calendars and improved computations that mattered for tithe reckoning and rent collection as much as for Easter tables. Discipline did not mean joylessness. Feast days brought processions that wove a city's neighborhoods into a single fabric, even if only for a day. When relics were carried through streets, stallholders paused while incense swirled. Children craned their necks, and guilds displayed their banners. And at fairs sanctioned by royal privilege, Frankfurt's Fair would later become famous. But smaller ones existed everywhere. The rhythm of buying and selling introduced men to goods from elsewhere. Salt from Holly, furs from the north, knives with better steel from along the Rhine, beads from Venice via Bavarian traders. Fairs were also courts in disguise. For the days of special protections, the peace of the market was enforced with unusual rigor. Thefts were punished swiftly, quarrels channeled to swift arbitration, and records made on wax tablets that could be transcribed later. If you follow the roads, you discover that Italy occupied a stubborn place in the imperial imagination and budget. The imperial title demanded care across the Alps, and that meant planning months ahead. Alpine passes are not conquered once. They are traversed each season. Wagons needed hubs greased and axles checked. For mountain stages, oxen were preferred for their steadiness, but cavalry mounts needed attentive stable masters to keep them sound. When the court descended into the Po Valley, the courts of Lombard cities demanded another etiquette. Negotiations with bishops and counts were now conducted amid merchant wealth and communal pride that were unlike the looser nobiliary society north of the Alps. The outcome was not a consistent policy, but an improvisational art extracting recognition and service from Italian lords while preserving German support for ventures that could feel distant and costly. Behind these imperial gestures, the domestic burdens continued without pride or pause. A peasant family in Saxony with strips in the village fields, planned around obligation days to the domain, plowing for the Lord in spring, haymaking in early summer, bringing in the grain in late summer, hauling wood in autumn. Tools were repaired during the dark months, and the animals were carefully apportioned through winter. With pigs on acorns when mast was good and cattle fed cut hay from common meadows. Women spun wool, brewed ale, and managed the small cash or barter flows that kept salt and iron within reach. Children worked early, sweeping barns, minding geese, learning the local prayers. On Sundays, whether in a small timber church or a stone one, if funds allowed, the priest recited the same words the kingdom over, even if his homily was brief and local. The tithe, 1 part in 10 in theory, negotiated in practice, moved from farm to altar. Part funding the economy of sanctity, part anchoring the politics of place. Military service, when called, was not an abstraction but a schedule. The king's summons did not reach every man. It reached those bound by rank and tenure. Counts led contingents, and bishops too, fielding men from their lands. An assembly point meant days away from home, a risk that someone else would harvest before you returned. For many, especially in border counties, service consisted of garrison duty, which was more about patience than gallantry. Night watches in towers, mending palisades, escorting supply convoys, standing guard for visiting dignitaries. For the few who rode with the king abroad, the journey was schooling in logistics, where to water horses, how to ration fodder, which bridges could bear baggage wagons, where to billet men without angering a monastery whose stores should not be despoiled. If its abbot was a royal friend, the edges of the realm were not just lines. They were zones of habit and exchange. To the east, Slavic polities across the Elbe were both foes and neighbors. And over time, they became partners, and then sometimes foes again. Missionaries traveled with interpreters and small gifts cloth, knives, salt, wine seeking, not conquest but conversion that might yield stable alliances. Where a new church was built, the first task was not doctrinal. It was carpentry, then roofing, then stump pulling to clear the churchyard, then the procurement of a bell if resources could stretch that far. Frontier captains, called margraves, kept a mixed economy of tribute and trade, with markets that drew both German and Slavic sellers. In the north, Danes and Saxons watched one another across maritime and riverine channels, sometimes raiding, sometimes trading, often both. The calendar kept repeating its advice: steady, steady, steady. Kings died and were replaced, and every succession required diplomacy among the stem duchy Saxony, Franconia, Swabia, Bavaria, and Lotharingia, as well as a speedy grip on symbolic places. Coronations unfolded in cities like Aachen or Mainz. Because the memory of Charlemagne and the weight of an archbishop's hand mattered as much as any legal formula. The rite did not produce obedience, it summoned it. The royal anointing, the presentation of sword and scepter and orb, did not feed soldiers or repair bridges. But those gestures knit the next year's itinerary to the last year's promises. A new king's first months were consumed with confirmations of rights, of markets, of tolls, of immunities, because to be confirmed was to continue living. As expected, under Otto II and Otto III, the balance tilted sometimes heavily toward Italy. Otto II's defeat near Stilo forced a pause that reverberated in Germany as some magnates tested boundaries. Theophanu's regency had to govern through both respect and calculation, and it managed by leaning on bishops and abbots who preferred steady partners to brash local lords. Otto III's grand ideas of a Roman Christian empire tied to a renewed papacy translated into real journeys, difficult Alps crossings, public acts in ancient spaces, and the elevation of Rome in the imperial mind. He admired scholars and drew to his courtmen who believed that ordered law was a path to ordered life. You might smile at the distance between such ideals and a shepherd's day, but there is a line connecting them. A more legible law helps even the humblest, who want the boundary stone to stay put and the measure to be honest. Henry II, following, leaned even more deliberately into the church alliance, establishing sees, endowing monasteries, and using ecclesiastical courts to channel disputes that dispute set might otherwise arm men. He is remembered as pious, but his piety was as political as any duke's pride. Patronage bound bishops tightly, and bishops, in turn, made excellent hosts, judges, and quartermasters. Under this pattern, the empire resembled not a tower but a trellis, a framework up which vines of local custom could grow without collapsing. It accommodates a difference while trying to enforce a minimum of fairness. Banditry was punished. Market fraud was named and fined. The peace of the king periodic proclamations of forbidden violence tempted to cut off cycles of revenge. Peace was never absolute, but it was invoked often enough to shape a habit of reaching first for adjudication. An empire can stand on the strength of its habits for a surprisingly long time. But there are seams in the fabric that are only visible once you tug. The power to appoint bishops made kings secure, and yet the more kings invested in that power, the more vulnerable they became to arguments that such appointments should be purely spiritual. The church reform currents, gathering in monasteries and chapters, were not born to oppose kings. They were born to improve discipline and holiness. But reformers are like millers who fix old wheels. Once they begin, they find other gears that could turn better. If simony, the buying and selling of ecclesiastical office, was condemned, then what of the gifts and pressures that came with royal patronage? If clerical marriage was discouraged or banned, then what of the dynastic meshes through which bishops had moved? And if Rome, reforming itself, sought to speak with a more commanding voice, what then of an emperor whose title was supposed to cradle Christendom? As kingship prepared to pass from the Ottonian line to the Salians, the empire seemed stable. The fortresses were maintained, the bishoprics endowed, the markets predictable, the roads known, the rituals rehearsed, and the charters copied and stored in armaria, where careful hands dusted them. And yet beneath the steady bell of prime and vespers, in the shuffle of traders at gates, in the twinned rhythms of sowing and harvest, there hung a question you can almost hear in the quiet. If the partnership between crown and crozier is the heart of this order, what happens when both partners claim the right to lead the dance? You return to a world where order is made from repetition, and where the grand stories, crowns, battles, and coronations do not drown out the softer rhythms of the year. To understand how the first arc of the empire concludes, you follow the last Saxon ruler, Henry II, not only in his courtly appearances, but in the manifestations of rule that rose and fell with bells and market days. It is late in the first quarter of the 11th century, and the structures built by Henry the Fowler and Otto the Great fortified places. The partnership with bishops, the itinerant court that knits localities together, have hardened into something durable. Yet even durability has a pulse. And while you watch the pulse, you also see the faint tremor of a transition coming. Henry II's world is a network of known places and known expectations. When he journeyed to Bamberg, a city he favored and endowed, he was not merely a pious founder, he was a planner of nodes. A bishopric there meant more than a cathedral. It meant granaries placed purposefully near roads and rivers. It meant a chapter of canons to keep records, host messengers, teach boys, and adjudicate petty disputes before they grew into costly feuds. It meant a courthouse attached to a church where an oath on a relic could smother a quarrel faster than an armed retinue might. For you, walking across the square on a market morning, it means the new bishop's steward, checking weights and measures, and the wool merchant grumbling that the silver content of coin must be held steady, because uncertainty is a tax by another. Name. Through Henry's piety, you can trace the mechanics of authority. He endowed monasteries and bishoprics, not because he thought politics was a worldly distraction from holiness, but because he saw how the house of prayer was also a house of order. A monastery's property did not drift. Its boundaries were recorded. Its fields were organized into rotations that made sense of poor soils and fickle weather. Its barns stood ready to absorb a bad harvest. Its obligation of hospitality was a safety net woven through the Midlands and the Marches. When the king spent the night at an abbey, he did not sleep under mere piety. He lay down inside a machine for keeping records, storing food, and teaching the art of writing, where a donation to the house's altar was also a payment into a future where debts and rights could be remembered long after a loud witness fell. Quiet, all this created the texture in which succession would unfold. For a realm that had inherited the Carolingian habit of alexia, king must be chosen. Even if dynasty narrowed, the field continuity depended on persuading magnates that regularity would outlive the man who embodied it. In the chapter houses, among the dukes, and in the halls of the counts who ran counties day by day, there was a checklist of normality, an itinerary that brought the king visibly near at predictable intervals, a chancery capable of issuing charters cleanly and swiftly, a ban that could be proclaimed and enforced, land peace decrees that set aside times when feuds must sleep, and a church that cooperated in smoothing disputes, giving absolution when necessary to stave off cycles of vengeance. The grand narrative of Henry II repeats these civilities with a special intensity. He founded, endowed, and adjusted. He leaned into ecclesiastical partnership, not as a mere pious gloss, but as a mechanism. Bishops, when tied firmly to royal patronage, gave the crown leverage against hereditary nobles. Cathedral canons educated the clerks who would populate chanceries and courts, and monasteries, under waves of reform, cultivated disciplined communities whose steadiness could be exported to daughter houses and dependencies. These reforms were not monolithic. Some houses embraced stricter Benedictine observance with careful attention to the rule. Others experimented with customs that renewed discipline. But everywhere reform tightened the weave of literate clerical governance. And the empire's paperwork, charters, privileges, judgments grew cleaner, more consistent, and therefore more persuasive. You feel the result in how people made decisions at small scales. A merchant planning a journey from Mainz to Regensburg could consult a mental map in which river tolls and road markets were stabilized by previous charters. A peasant family in Swabia could calculate labor days owed to a monastery's domain, rent in grain or poultry owed at Michaelmas, and the possibility of selling a surplus of beans at a fair if the season's rains were not cruel. A minor noble could guess the price of disobedience in money and in time how many days of hosting the royal court would repay a slight. How public an apology must be. How secure were the immunities attached to lands gifted to a church where his brother was a canon. These calculations measured a life within a system, and a system survives transitions better than a prince if the measures are steady. When Henry II died childless in 1024, the moment required exactly this system's confidence. The election that followed favored Conrad of Franconia, the first of the Salian line. You can watch the transition at two speeds. At the slow speed, life changes almost not at all. A blacksmith in a village near Speyer continues to fashion nails and knives, balancing charcoal and iron and quenching his tools while his apprentice pumps the bellows and counts to himself to keep pace. In a monastic grange, the cellarer records the contents of granaries, the gardener sets out winter cabbages, and the shepherd checks that the ewes are ready for lambing. A traveling merchant curses and relights his torch to push through a dim gate just before it closes, the gatekeeper muttering about the seriousness of curfew. At the fast speed, a king is chosen. Oaths are sworn. A coronation is arranged in a place where the old rites speak loudly O Khan, Mainz, or Kalanand. Envoys ride in knots across the stem duchies to confirm and be confirmed. Conrad II's early gestures held to continuity. He ratified rights, confirmed immunities, and presented himself as the next steward of a pattern rather than the breaker of it. That style mattered more than any immediate innovation, because those who possess swords and sealsdukes and bishops need to see themselves inside a familiar story. Look again at the charters. They carry new names, but the same formulas. The king always grants at the request of the queen, or the duke, or the bishop present in the court. The boundaries of a gift are spelled out in the same careful manner, by streams, by stones, by the borders of another's wood. The penalties for violation invoke the same threats of public fines and divine displeasure. Copyists in cathedral scriptoria did not need to alter their hands to accommodate the new line. They only needed to spell a new name with the old flourishes. And seals needed a new dye, not a new ritual. Yet even while honoring continuity, the Salian accession brought different angles of emphasis. The Ottonian habit of using bishops as pillars of governance remained. But the Salians also had to reckon with duchies that had learned their own habits of negotiation over the previous century. The Duchy of Swabia, the marches in the east, the long corridor of the Rhine, and the east-west axis toward Italy were all channels where ships, carts, and quarrels traveled. Conrad II consolidated more vigorously in some places, and you can track consolidation by small annoyances. A new schedule of toll collections, a sharper inspection of coinage, a firmer insistence that certain cases be heard in the king's presence, rather than disposed of by local custom alone. Raising the floor of order can feel like a crowding of elbows for those used to broad tables. Negotiation becomes negotiation with fewer loopholes. Italy. That perennial promissory note in imperial budgets remained both prize and preoccupation. Conrad like a toad drew legitimacy from an imperial coronation that tied him to Rome in the language of ceremony, law, and memory. But beyond the coronation, Italy meant the long work of understanding communal elites in cities such as Pavia and Milan. The ambitions of bishops who were both civic and spiritual leaders. And the corridors of wealth that could replenish a treasury, if handled with care. This care was practical. When and where to summon troops across the Alps, how to supply them, which passes to secure with gifts and which with threats, when to accept local compromises instead of pressing a legal claim for rights that could be enforced only at great cost. The empire was never merely a German thing with an Italian appendix. It was a north-south system in which each end waited while the other was mended. A quilt laid out and stitched by teams working from opposite sides, as Conrad's reign matured. The rhetoric around the empire tilted subtly toward a more conscious legalism, where earlier kings had made of their rule a liturgical and material partnership with churches. Conrad and his successors began speaking more openly in terms of right and jurisdiction of the king's ban and regalia. You feel this not in high philosophical tracts, but in the wording of conflict settlements. A count claims a right to collect a toll at a bridge. A bishop objects. The king's court weighs not only custom and piety, but the royal interest. Because rights can be imagined, they can also be enumerated, and enumeration involves scribes. Schedules and the dull genius of lists. Lists travel. They are copied. They become precedents. Precedents tempt argument. An argument is healthy if you have a court that endures, which the empire does in the form of the royal court rotating. Through places where cathedrals can host and record, the church's reforming spirit, already alive in the late Ottonian world, hummed louder now. Voices within monastic communities and cathedral chapters called for greater purity of practice, for an end to simony appointments stained by transactions that looked like buying office, and for a clergy that looked more like its ideals. These voices did not begin by opposing kings. They began by opposing the slack that had grown around sacred offices. But the more vigorously reformers pulled at the tangle of custom, the more they came near fibers that also bound royal authority. 2 ecclesiastical seats, if bishops were to be selected with less entanglement in lay hands. What then of a king whose most reliable administrators were exactly those bishops whose gratitude had always bent toward the crown? If clerical celibacy became more strictly enforced, what then happened to the webs of kinship and political familiarity that had helped keep the peace? The question was not yet an explosion. It was a vibration you could feel through stone. Daily life absorbed these vibrations without losing step. The heavy plow continued to pull new earth into the economy in pockets where soil and village cooperation made it sensible. Watermills multiplied, saving hands from the long drag of grinding grain and giving millers positions of importance in hamlets and towns. Markets flourished more often within walls, because gates meant tolls and tolls meant officials. And officials meant that disputes could be heard and theft punished, making the risk of bringing goods from farther away worth. Fairs took on their festival character, a few days of guaranteed peace, protections for sellers and buyers, and the soft pressure of being part of the king's peace. Crafts organized into looser associations before guilds hardened their shape. Masters took apprentices, and a child's world expanded with the arrival of peddlers, tinkers, pipers, and traveling preachers who momentarily thickened the horizon of a place that usually measured itself by field boundaries and the nearest bridge. Meanwhile, the royal itinerary remained the quiet masterpiece of administration. The names became familiar and then were taken for granted. Ingelheim for a spring assembly. Mainz for a solemn feast with an archbishop's long shadow over both. Altar and charter table, Laslar, with its palace and chapel, for a gathering where northern lords were better represented. A reach across the Alps when the season permitted. Kitchens planned months ahead. Stables tallied fodder. Clerks rehearsed. Formulas. Abbeys prepared guest houses for the press of bodies and voices. The court was work, not pageant. It was the conversion of time into authority. Every confirmation of a privilege during one visit bought patience in an absence that might last 2 or 3 years. Every fair proclaimed under royal protection created a context for 100 future contracts. Every judgment recorded trained local men to think of conflict as negotiable, at least for the middle cases where pride and law could shake hands. If you wanted to measure the success of this first imperial century and a half, you might count not victories, but postponements. The realm postponed crises by giving them new names and new schedules. An inheritance quarrel became a mediated settlement with witnesses. A breach of the peace became a fine plus a penance. A bishop's death became an occasion to confirm gifts and reorganize rights at the moment of a successor's oath. Postponement is not cowardice. It is a method of spreading shock into time until people can absorb it. And Henry II's particular grace was to learn the rhythm of postponement so that a realm could breathe between pressures. This breathing made the Salian moment possible. When Conrad II took the scepter, he did not pretend to invent governing. He presented himself as the good steward of what the realm already recognized as practicable. And yet, in the margins of this quiet competence, you can hear the creak of straining wood. The reliance on bishops that had stabilized a realm also made those offices supremely valuable in a way that attracted scruple and ambition alike. The very reforms that tightened monastic life and cleansed parts of the church's economy of favors tempted stronger claims about who should hold the ring, the staff, the crozier. The concept of the emperor as a guardian of the church, the secular arm to the church's spiritual authority, began to compete with the concept of the church as guardian even of the emperor's soul, with special rights over the terms by which ecclesiastical offices were filled. When you watch a new bishop receive symbols of his office from a king, you might notice not only the ceremony's beauty, but its ambiguity. Is this the best expression of the partnership, or the seed of a dispute about who gets to sanctify the act? As the Salian line stepped into its role, the empire's script continued in familiar hand with a new chapter title. The borders did not move dramatically. The roads did not change course. The churches did not transform their chants, but words. Like reform, investiture, and peace began to settle in the same sentences as ban, market, and toll. The great assemblies still proclaimed law and rendered judgment, but they started to do so in a climate where two kinds of right secular and spiritual began to insist on being articulated distinctly. You stand in a nave as a royal charter is read and a bishop's privilege confirmed, and you can feel that the old warmth between crown and crozier now shares the air with a new coolness that is not yet a wind but might soon be one. The first story of the empire, the Saxon story, therefore concludes not in triumph or collapse, but in consolidation perfected to the point of tension. The Atinians and Henry II gave the realm its habits, mobile presence, partnership with churches, a preference for adjudication, and a bone-deep appreciation for the ordinary. The Salians inherited these habits and began to press them into a more assertive frame, in which law sharpened its edge and Italy's pull grew steadier. The quiet brilliance of the system made it sturdy. The quiet change in the terms of partnership made it fragile. You might take a final glance at a parchment spread on a trestle table. The wax still warm, the scribe's hand steady, the lines regular, the seal impressed cleanly. And ask yourself, as the hall begins to empty and the day's light thins, if this empire is a fabric woven from oaths and offices shared by king and bishop, what tier will form when each hand reaches for the needle at once? And how far will that tier travel before someone learns how to mend it? You begin again on a winter road, because the years when the empire tested its own seams come in a season of cold. The Salian kings Conrad II, Henry III, and Henry IV inherit not a wealth of cash, but a wealth of expectations and a network of places prepared to provide hospitality, judgment, and men. Conrad II strengthened the sense that royal law could reach across customary boundaries. Henry III, with personal gravity and a reputation for stern fairness, extended the presence of imperial power both north and south of the Alps. Bishops remained partners, and the court's rotation continued to stitch duchies together. Yet, in the same decades, a reforming spirit sighed monasteries. Cathedral chapters and the papal court gathered its resolve to clean up abuses that had become systemic. The words simony and Nicolaitanism, precise and technical, began to feature in sermons and letters. Beneath them lay a broader impulse to draw a clearer line between the spiritual and the secular. Henry III's tenure shows the peak of Salian assurance. He influenced papal appointments during a period of Roman weakness, convened synods, and radiated a sense that the emperor, as protector of the church, could also be a tuner of its instruments. You can walk into a court session in Mainz and witness an emperor who expects bishops to serve the realm as judges and quartermasters, and bishops who meaningfully do so. In the same season, reforms in places like Cluny are maturing. They produce communities of disciplined prayer whose reputation travels by letters and visiting abbots. Meanwhile, legal thinking around the papacy thickens. A stronger theory of Petrine authority Rome's right to purify and govern. Church life is articulated with a clarity that had usually been muddied by ordinary compromise. Then Henry IV grows into his office, and the lines of confidence draw into sharper angles. As a child, he ruled through regions. As he matured, he confronted dukes who tested royal will, most famously in Saxony, where memories of dignity were close to the bone. He also confronted a papacy under Hildebrand Pope Gregory VII that had found its discipline, its voice, and its program. Gregory spoke a language of reform that brooked less compromise about the role of lay hands in investing bishops with rings and staffs, symbols that reformers believed should pass through spiritual fingers alone. The investiture dispute began with letters and admonitions, but letters can bite. They carry threat without sword and judgment without army. For excommunication can cut as cleanly as a blade when all agree that sacraments bind the living to their maker. On the ground, investiture looks like a ceremony in a hall where the king, or his representative, hands a bishop a ring and a staff after election in which royal persuasion had often been decisive. On the ground, reform looks like a chapter insisting that simony corrupts souls, and that bishops should be chosen without the whiff of purchase or the press of princely fingers. The practices had long been reconciled by convenience. Now convenience met doctrine, and doctrine, once grasped with conviction, is a hard thing to let go. The dispute also carried politics deftly tucked inside its sleeve. If kings could not invest bishops, their leverage over crucial administrators shrank. If popes could command which hands performed sacred investiture, their leverage grew not only over bishops, but indirectly over kings who depended on those bishops for the tasks of governance. Henry IV's excommunication by Gregory VII exploded these latent tensions into public shock. In practice, excommunication was both a spiritual wound and a political weapon. Vassals swore to obey a Christian king. If that king was cut off from the sacraments, the knot of oaths frayed. Princes who disliked Henry's rule could cloak their resistance in piety. A German landscape already scored by noble rivalry became a chessboard where moves borrowed the words of reform and counter-reform. The winter journey to Canossa in 1077, when Henry IV crossed the Alps to meet Gregory, is often retold for its pathos, the emperor standing in penitential posture before a pope in a mountain fortress. The simpler truth is that symbol can unwind. Politics faster than arms. By appearing to submit, Henry broke a coalition, but submission did not settle doctrine. Forgiveness cleared a slate for the moment. It did not rewrite the script. In Germany, the turmoil echoed through counties and convents. You picture a count explaining to his men that they must now hold back because their king is under a cloud. A bishop instructing his priests on the proper form of prayers when the sovereign's name, once voiced after the gospel, is now awkward to speak. A monastery deciding whether to receive or refuse envoys from a ruler at odds with Rome. Yet normality was stubborn. St. Martin's wine still needed pressing. Transhumance routes still needed managing. Villages still owed labor to their lords in spring and autumn. Millers still kept careful records of who brought how much grain and how many sacks. In a paradox that runs through the empire's history, the same apparatus that made the realm resilient ritual habit. Devices for postponement now also constrained the speed with which rupture could spread. Even while factions hardened, the toll collector at a bridge needed to show up. And merchants found their way past disputes because shells of protection still existed around markets and fairs. The rivalry produced counter-kings. Most notably, Rudolph of Rheinfelden, and stretched across decades. In the background, the countenance of dukedoms changed. Bavaria, Swabia, Franconia, and Saxony recalibrated their internal balances as houses rose and fell, sometimes in sync with papal or imperial. Pressure, sometimes for simpler reasons, like deaths, marriages, and local accidents. A notable feature of this time is the rise of ministerial serving. Knights of unfree legal status who became crucial administrators and fighters for both bishops and princes. Their presence is a microcosm of the era. Law grows more articulated. And paradoxes abound because an unfree man in one sense can command men and hold fiefs in another. In their hands, you see the empire's ability to turn constraints into functions. A bishop who cannot rely on hereditary nobles might prefer ministers whose fortunes depend wholly on their lord's favor. Urban life thickened under the shutter. Stone replaced timber in more walls. Romanesque churches, squat and serene, spread their rounded arches across bishoprics and abbeys, and their capitals carve vine scrolls and beasts that invite quiet inspection. Urban councils began to look more like institutions than occasions. Market law was specified in town customals. Guild-like associations of weavers, smiths, and merchants formed and negotiated with urban lords for privileges, toll reductions, and access to justice. These developments did not stall because the king and the pope argued. They continued, guided by people who were used to making systems work even when superiors changed their tone. In Italy, the investiture conflict bled into civic pride and communal politics. Cities such as Milan and Piacenza had elites who were perfectly capable of using papal rhetoric to restrain imperial officials when it suited them, and of using imperial rhetoric to restrain bishops when it did not. Henry IV's Roman adventures, including installing an antipope and being crowned emperor in an alternative ceremony, show how the dispute forced improvisation. Improvisation is expensive. Armies must be paid or fed. Bridges must be guarded. Alpine passes cannot be crossed with declarations alone. In the north, princes considered whether the emperor's Italian ventures benefited them or merely drew resources southward. Calculations of advantage replaced oath-bound obedience in a wider range of decisions. Henry IV's long struggle ended in weariness and partial inversion. His son, Henry V, inherited not only a throne, but a problem set: reform. Currents had not ebbed. The papacy had grown more confident. The princes were accustomed to bargaining. The question of investiture narrowed into procedure. Who presents a bishop? Who invests him with symbols? And what exactly those symbols mean in a legal register? Do rings and staffs signify spiritual office only, or do they implicate temporal rights such as lands and tolls? Can the emperor claim a separate right for temporalities, leaving the spiritual investiture to ecclesiastical hands? And will the Pope accept such a split? The generations that followed would craft compromise from these questions, but compromises still lay ahead when Henry V began his reign by pressing ancient royal claims with new urgency in the towns. Meanwhile, a style of life was consolidating. Merchants kept accounts more carefully. Some began to experiment with double-entry ideas in their own rough form. Contracts were witnessed and written in town halls. Jews present in many urban centers occupied a specific place in the economy, often as moneylenders due to restrictions on Christian usury and because their diasporic connections could move capital across regions. They lived under the empire's protective charters, in theory, under the local lord's temperament in practice, in a tension that would become tragically familiar later. Rural rhythms continued. 3-field rotations where they made sense, 2-field elsewhere. The slow expansion of settlement into marginal lands. The draining of swamps and coordinated efforts that required lords to incentivize settlers with temporary freedoms from rents and dues. Back at court, ritual tried to hold meaning steady. Coronations, hoftage, and assemblies continued. Bishops processed with croziers, dukes arrived with banners, and notaries sharpened quills. But speeches acquired a sharper edge. The language of two powers, the regnum and the sacerdotium scepter and crozier, sought a new equilibrium. It is important for you to hear how boring the dispute often was in practice. For every dramatic letter of anathema, there were 5. Tedious sessions about the terms of a cathedral, chapter's election, or a count's lawsuit against a bishop over a mill's income. The grandeur of Canassa's image is a thin layer over a vast subsoil of drafts. Erasures and seals pressed into wax while kitchens roasted meat for men, whose strongest sensation of the empire that day was the smell of fat and smoke. Out of this boring work came the preconditions for settlement. Princes who had learned the taste of interposition were eager not to be swallowed whole by either pope or emperor. Bishops preferred predictability. Chapters preferred their rights to election, recognized. Kings preferred, if forbidden spiritual investiture, to retain as much of the temporal leash as could be kept taut. The final shape of compromise, somewhere over the horizon at this point, would concede the spiritual symbols to ecclesiastical hands while preserving for the emperor a role in conferring the worldly regalia lands, honors and rights that made a bishop, a prince, as well as a pastor. But compromises are chosen not mere by reason, but by fatigue. The empire, used to making time an ally, stretched the dispute until enough men were ready to accept a division of meaning as a way to keep the roads clear and the fairs open. In this first section of a turbulent story, you might be tempted to reduce everything to a simple quarrel between church and state. Resist that temptation. What you are watching is a system learning new terms for old tensions, the balance between charisma and office, the trade between spiritual authority and temporal necessity, the price of a crown that depends on bishops in a church that wants to be pure. The Salians did not abandon the Saxon habits. They pressed them into harder shapes. The church did not suddenly invent reform. It invited the empire to share burdens with a different calculus of dignity. And ordinary people who slept under thatched roofs and counted in measures of grain and lengths of cloth, kept moving under a sky that looked the same even when the chancery's phrasing changed. As the winter road to Canassa recedes and letters fly across Alps as often as armies, you are left to ask, when a realm agrees to split a ceremony into 2 meanings, will the words keep the peace, or will the same old hands reach again and again across the divide because habit and need do not respect a line drawn in ink? You step into a hall where the air smells of wax and damp wool, and where a long table is covered with folded parchments, seals prepared but not yet pressed. The arguments have become procedural, and in their procedure, you sense a way forward. What began as letters that stung reputations and excommunications that cut oaths now moves toward a craft of distinction. After long years of friction, the empire's leading men have grown weary enough to turn doctrine into method and method into peace. The path from quarrel to concord is marked by small words: election, investiture, temporalities, spiritualities. You sit in the back of the room watching bishops, princes, and royal envoys argue in a monotone that is all the more powerful for lacking heat. They want a settlement that allows everyone to continue the work that their lands require. Before the settlement arrives, the decades carry their own rearrangements. Henry IV grows old in struggle and dies amid the embers of unfinished claims, leaving Henry V to shape a position that is both filial and pragmatic. Henry V pushes firmly. At first, sometimes with the bluntness of someone who believes that clarity is the shortest path to order. Yet clarity in one register often means resistance in another. Chapters insist they must elect freely. Popes insist sacred signs must be given by sacred hands. Kings insist that worldly duties and rights attached to bishoprics require a secular right, somewhere to keep them tethered to the realm's needs. The arguments turn on gestures. A ring means fidelity and spiritual marriage to a church. A staff means shepherding souls. A scepter means jurisdiction over lands and tolls. The more precisely everyone speaks, the more possible it becomes to split ceremonies without splitting the body of the realm. Meanwhile, life in the duchies and counties does not halt for theory. Princes grow more careful in their household management because a world thick with claims requires better books. Chamberlains track revenues from mills and ferries. Marshals standardize the burdens of castle guard and bridge work. Stewards calculate food renders from countryside to granaries with a sharper eye for shortfalls. Ministerials, sand-free knights, who rise into positions of trust, become the grease of lordship. Their lack of ancient lineage can be a feature. They depend on favor, not hereditary right, and so they carry out orders with fewer angles of personal pride. They record duties, inspect stables, maintain garrisons, and accompany envoys overpasses where a good memory of where fodder can be had is worth more than stern speeches about fidelity. The towns grow quietly stronger. Stone replaces timber in walls and towers, and markets begin to run by written customaries that visitors can learn and recite. A merchant from the Rhineland knows what toll he will pay to cross a bridge in Swabia, because the schedule of tolls is now posted and enforced by a set of officials whose office is more regular than it used to be. Weights and measures have neighbors, inspectors who carry stamped irons and reference stones to check scales and length rods. Bakers can still cheat, but they do so with nervous glances because punishment is regular and public. Behind these practicality stands the legal tone of the age. Not only popes, but princes, bishops, and councils speak in a lawyer's cadence. The more people rely on writing to fix expectations, the more power flows to those who can compose formulas and keep archives where those formulas can be found when tempers are high. A figure like Lothar III, who rises after Henry V, shows how these currents meet. Elected in 1125, he carries himself less as a conqueror than as a moderator of pressures. He secures his kingship by giving confirmations to those whose support he needs and by presenting himself as a steward of an order that must be rebuilt from intricacy rather than invented from majesty. His reign is a hinge between Salian assertion and Stauffen consolidation, and through it runs the thread of a developing compromise. The empire remains stretched toward Italy in imagination and ceremony, but the center of gravity, a tangle of duchies, marches, and church lordships, demands a style of rule that is good at turning loud questions into quiet routines. It is no accident that the men around him are competent in the most boring of arts. drafting and redrafting phrases until what was impossible becomes merely awkward. The settlement that everyone needs arrives at Worms in 1122, with a concordat that wears a legal face and carries a practical soul. It affirms that bishops are to be elected in canonical form, that their spiritual symbols, the ring and the staff, belong to the Church's right, and that the king may, before or after consecration, depending on region, invest the elected man with the regalia, the temporalities of the office, by a touch of the scepter. The split is not neat in every town on the first day, but it is workable in most places most of the time. What matters is not the debate you can still hear in cloisters about symbolism. What matters is that the empire's administrators can mark 2 ceremonies on a calendar and teach men how to behave at each. The venerable words remain oath, fealty, fidelity, but they are now spoken in a choreography that softens the hard edges of previous years. In the wake of Worms, you hear less thunder in sermons and more scratching in scriptoria. Chapters refine their election procedures. Queens and princes refine their modes of intercession. Kings refine the forms by which they promise to protect the rights of church lands. Privileges are recited aloud and then copied. Seals are impressed and then recorded in registers where each page is lined with a careful ruling and labeled for easy reference. Bishops attend diets and take their places with a more settled dignity. They know who chose them and under what conditions they hold their temporalities. Some will still test boundaries. The human taste for advantage does not melt under procedure. But over long miles, the behavior of offices grows more predictable. Predictability is not a drumbeat. It is a hum that keeps both markets and monasteries in tune. Even as the settlement reduces one kind of friction, another kind of contest rises into view. The rivalry of great houses who imagine the empire as a field on which to grow their branches. The Staufen and the Welf are not mere surnames. They are geographies and networks. When Conrad III, the first Hohenstaufen king, ascends in 1138, you sense a different temperature in the halls. He is elected in rivalry with a Welf claimant, and compromise must be found between families whose maps overlap but whose ambitions do not. The art of association acquires its own rituals, hostages given to assure fidelity, marriages arranged to connect corridors of land, shared campaigns promise to wash mutual suspicion in common danger. Conrad's reign mixes advancement and setback, with a crusade that swallows resources and returns to little, and with domestic programs that try to bind princes to a stiffer understanding of royal lead. Amid these contests, everyday governance grows a denser skin. If you walk with a royal envoy into an imperial abbey, you will find a cartularian organized book of copied charters kept on a chain or under lock. That lets an abbot summon 20 or 30 precedents to prove a right. If you visit a ducal court, you will see the chest where the duke keeps his seals, the rack where he keeps rods for measuring cloth, and the cupboard where toll schedules are stored by road and by fare. If you talk to a city council, you will hear about the calibration of the city's master ell, the rod for measuring cloth, and the enforcement of a rule that requires foreign merchants to offer certain goods at a public sale before they are allowed to continue their journey. These systems constrain petty greed enough that the grander movements of politics can occur without constant interruption by panic. The Concordat's greatest success may be psychological. It teaches elites that opponency can be framed so it does not require either party to surrender its self-respect. Bishops can believe they are free in their spiritual lives and loyal in their temporal ones. Kings can believe they have retained the means to knit the empire together by offices that owe them their worldly hands. Chapters can believe their elections matter. Princes can believe the old partnership of crown and crozier has become less capricious. None of this mutinous the older questions entirely. There are still popes who dream of a papal monarchy, and emperors who dream of a revived Roman justice filling Italy like a high flood. But the new habits lower the panic of every deviation. Deviations can be admitted to a docket and decided next month at a diet rather than thrown into the fire as a crisis, and now you feel a turning toward a new kind of grandeur. One that will not dismantle the worm's arrangement, but will test its endurance. Frederic, I called Barbarossa, will take the scepter with a taste for order and a scent for theater. He will attempt to write the regnum clearly on the map of Italy, to speak with a voice that makes the North answer when the South calls, and to draw princes into schemes that demand more of them than mere attendance. He will summon jurists to revive Roman law as a language for imperial rights. And he will hold diets where the law is meant to shine like polished bronze. The towns of Lombardy will have their say. Popes will measure him. German princes will calculate. And through these interactions, the empire will thicken or thin in ways no formula can predict. As your eye lifts from the routine comfort of 2 ceremonies and the rustle of reliable charters, you might ask, when a ruler tries to add magnificence to method, will his show of order steady the 1,000 small centers he governs, or will the very attempt to shine split them into a constellation too bright to hold in a single sky? You stand at the edge of a broad assembly field where pavilions fly banners that flicker like scales in a shifting wind. The empire has gathered, and at its center walks a king with a red beard whose bearing is both ornamental and practical. Frederick I has a talent for turning the routine into ceremony and ceremony into leverage. He calls diets with care, choosing places whose halls and churches offer enough weight to cradle ambitious declarations. He summons jurists who can clothe old claims in a firmer language. He understands that for princes whose obligations are seasonal and whose patience is measured in cartloads of grain, spectacle is not a distraction, but a necessary cost of persuading them that their service is part of something more than a series of favors. The revival of Roman law in schools and courts pleases him because it offers a grammar in which imperial rights can be configured as articles rather than memories. He convenes the famous diet at Roncaglia near Piacenza in 1158, where jurists help define the regalia rights that belong to the empire as empire. The list carries the sober weight of markets and bridges, tolls and coins, roads and rivers, itinerant judges and fixed penalties. It is a way to set aside the ad hoc, to say that a bridge toll is not a local habit, but a right that flows from the crown's duty to maintain safe crossing. What matters for you, watching from the crowd, is how such assertions move from parchment to practice. They require officials with authority, records with durability, and roads with stones rather than mud. The more Frederick asserts, the more he must build or borrow the skeleton that can bear the weight of resolution. Italy is the proving ground for this ambition. The cities of Lombardy have their own habits of governance, with consuls and councils that speak for a community of merchants and artisans. They respect the emperor's title. They fear his troops. They resent his legates who try to smell out every unpaid toll. The medley of interests can be held together if the emperor visits rarely and grants broadly. Frederick visits often and demands clearly. He expects a hierarchy of command in a land where autonomy is not a theory but a daily practice, a council that chooses its officials, a market that pays for its own peace, a militia that musters at a bell. In response to imperial pressure, cities build alliances, the Lombard League, that wrap their particularities in a cloak of solidarity. Solidarity does not erase rivalries between cities such as Milan and Cremona. It suspends them for the moment and converts the energy into common fortification. Popes, who share a peninsula and a horizon with emperors, enter the drama with a sense of posture sharpened by centuries. Frederick favors an antipope at one stage and contends with Alexander III at another. And while the issues are clothed in theology and ecclesiology, they are also made of tactics and resources. A pope who enjoys the allegiance of cities can embarrass an emperor who wants a cleaner line of command. A pope who must flee Rome can be reminded that his safety travels in imperial escort. The orbit of German princes complicates every calculation because they are not instruments. They are partners with counters of their own. A campaign in Lombardy costs coin and patience north of the Alps. And coin and patience have ways of draining into local projects. A new wall in a ducal town. A bridge that needs rebuilding, a quarrel. With a neighbor that cannot wait, in the north, Frederick cultivates order with decrees that speak to everyday ailments. He proclaims peace is the land for Eid and that aim to collapse private violence into the public jurisdiction of courts. The words forbid feuding and set times when no one may wage private war. He tries to establish a scaffold of royal judges and sets of rules that will spare merchants and farmers from arbitrary tolls and sudden theft. These programs are as much pedagogy as compulsion. They teach the habit of walking to a court instead of to a strong room, of seeking a writ instead of a retainer. The teaching takes in some places and not in others, because enforcement relies on princes and bishops, who must see the benefit of giving up slices of their own right to punish. Cities north of the Alps feel the touch of this order in charters that confirm their freedoms in exchange for support, service, and a higher grade of cooperation. Imperial cities become a category recognized in a thicker sense, not only as places whose walls belong to no prince, but as nodes where royal rights are exercised more directly. Councils gain the right to elect certain officials. Citizens gain laws that lower the temperature of disputes. Markets gain protections that attract traders whose wagons add to a city's wealth in the simplest way. Volume, crafts organize. Apprentices move through forms toward mastery. Weights and measures are harmonized block by block. Frederick does not invent urban growth. He sanitizes parts of it and puts the imperial stamp on others. A stamp is not a power plant. It is a reminder that a lid exists at the top of several pots, and that the hand on the lid belongs to a man who expects deference when he is present. At court, the chancellery under men like Reynold of Dassel shapes a rhetoric of empire that makes ordinary administrators feel larger than their rooms. Descriptions of the regnum glow. Ceremonies are polished. Seals bear images that tell stories, with a Gothic calm. The personnel around Frederick, including his relatives and loyalists, spread the work through kin and friendship. Beatrice of Burgundy, his wife, adds lands and connections that redraw the map of obligation. Marriage is once again policy woven into the quiet jewelry of a queen. Distant from the thickest matter of Lombardy, the empire's eastern marshes hum with their own projects. Settlement and cultivation move forward. Missionaries and lords carve spaces for new parishes and villages. And settlers from the west learn the soils and streams of lands that will be turned into stable provinces by a language of rent and law rather than by flag alone. Then the clash with Lombard freedom sharpens into combat that cities cannot simply arbitrate away, and the battle near Legnano in 1176 delivers a verdict that only partly belongs to swords. An imperial army meets a citizen militia organized in a league of towns, and the result is an imperial check that announces a truth. An emperor who wants to regulate Italy must find room for cities that are capable of planning their own survival. The victory of a league over a king's men is not the end of an empire. It is the birth of a new equilibrium. The Peace of Constance in 1183 acknowledges this by making space for municipal privileges, while requiring the forms of imperial oversight. Cities can hold courts, appoint officials, and keep the business of streets under their own keys. But they pay homage and accept the frame within which imperial rights are considered real. The arrangement is not ideal for glory. It is suitable for work. Frederick's policies thus produce two textures at once: a ceremonial magnificence that flatters the imagination of a reunited Rome, and a practical federalism that admits the stubborn, Reality of many centers. Princes in Germany note what the cities have obtained and tune their own requests accordingly. Bishops absorb lessons about what privileges can be clothed as responsibilities. The Chancellery records settlements that will be cited for decades. The effort of making war and peace in Italy drains coffers and fatigues vassals. The effort of codifying rights and pacifying roads produces quieter dividends in the north. You notice a symmetry. The more the emperor insists on the unity of law, the more distinct the local articulations of that law become. Distinction is not disobedience. It is the language by which hundreds of places say yes without surrendering the memory of their own names. The end of Frederick's story comes far from court in 1190. When he dies on crusade, crossing a river in Anatolia, a practical death for a practical man in a landscape where practicalities decide everything. His disappearance removes a center of gravity that had held a wide system in a balance of admiration, fear, and negotiation. The work of his years does not vanish. It sits in charters' walls, wells, bridges, and in the ways men expect to be treated. When they enter a market or write to a court, but the ambition of a single orbit dims, and the empire returns to the pattern that has become its deepest habit, a rhythm of assemblies, confirmations, and partial reforms. A caravan of rights that shifts weight from wagon to wagon without tipping entirely. Your eye returns to the lutheries of work, to the chanceries where seals cool and cords are trimmed, to watermills and their ceaseless splashing, to craft halls, where masters lecture apprentices on the origin of their rules, to tax farms that count coins by the weight of a balance, not by the speed of a pen. Barbarossa's name will become a legend of continuity in troubled times, a wish for a sleeping king who returns when needed. But his true legacy lies in the way he forced a discourse of law to emerge in cities and at courts, a discourse that people could lean on even when wind and grain failed. The empire leaves his reign with a clearer sense that it is a body made of many hands and many clocks, each of which must be respected if the whole is to keep time. You may then ask, as the pavilions come down and the field returns to grass, whether the empire, now habituated to thrive as a federation of routines, will manage the next art that history demands, the art of remembering itself when no single man's orbit is large enough to draw every eye at once. You move into a century that begins with a vacuum and teaches a lesson in how spaces fill. After Frederick II dies in 1250, the empire enters a time historians call an interregnum. Not because there were no kings, there were claimants, and even coronations, but because the binding presence that turns claim into confidence is missing. What matters for you is how people behave when the spine relaxes. Princes discover that their reach can lengthen if they organize better. Cities discover that their wealth can command more deference if they close ranks. Bishops discover that their courts can regulate more life if they regularize their records. The interregnum is not chaos. It is a period of accelerated pluralism, where the grammar of power changes from sentences about a single subject to sentences with many clauses. Look first at the princes. Their households grow into administrations that can harvest land's produce more effectively than before. They consolidate territories by marital policy, purchase, and patient leverage rather than by constant war. The vocabulary for these moves becomes specialized. In fiefments, mortgages of lands, pledges of tolls, exemptions from certain dues, each is a tool. Stewards and treasurers keep better books, and the men who serve as clerks learn to write in a hand that others can read from. One principality to another, castles proliferate not as romantic pinnacles, but as administrative hubs with storerooms and writing windows. Market towns become ducal projects, granted privileges that draw merchants to places where tolls can be counted and courts can sit. Now watch the cities. They prosper as trade thickens along river routes and overland roads. The affordability and reliability of wagons, the slowing pace of warfare in some corridors, and the rise of a credit culture among merchants all contribute to a web of regular exchange. Commodity flows are recognizable: cloth from Flanders and Lombardy, salt from mines that change the taste of otherwise poor seasons, fish carried dried or salted inland, metals trickling out of mountain regions where mining is both risk and promise. City councils become more like institutions than assemblies. They issue statutes. They create offices to police markets and control fire risk. They regulate building materials and roof lines. They set times for night watches and impose fines on those who neglect them. Guilds grow into civic actors. They set quality standards and protect training rituals through apprenticeship terms that ensure both skill and socialization. The Church, resilient through reform and argument, now acts as an essential document factory and court system. Bishops' chanceries keep registers that permit long memories so that disputes can be settled by reference rather than by threat. Ecclesiastical courts handle marriage, inheritance questions with spiritual angles, and contracts that men prefer. To submit to a judge with a habit of routine, monasteries are themselves changing. Some shrink in influence. Others expand as centers of literate administration where lay lords borrow talent. A new religiosity, the mendicant orders of Franciscans and Dominicans, moves through towns, bringing preaching that sharpens consciences and, in sharpening, sometimes complicates politics by giving artisans and merchants a vocabulary for criticizing greed and corruption without reaching for a sword. Amid this thickening, the empire's highest form, that old habit of kingship and coronation, continues to matter just as the full moon matters, even when it does not have the tide in its grip. Rudolph of Habsburg's election in 1273 marks a restoration of better order. And you notice the way rituals are used to teach people that continuity is possible after interruption. He reclaims lands once claimed by the Stauffen crown. He courts bishops' support. He binds himself to practices that make princes feel respected. The Habsburg name begins its long story, not because it suddenly overwhelms rivals, but because it shows an appetite for administration and a genius for marrying. Advantage that aligns with the era's grammar. The absence of a domineering center allows and compels enunciation of rules that make life livable across boundaries. Step into a fair in Frankfurt or a market in Nuremberg, and you will encounter guest meat, a special piece extended to visiting traders, and a set of courts that sit for the duration to settle disputes swiftly. The fair law is almost a parallel. Jurisdiction. It expedites, it compromises, and it permits continuation rather than victory. Carriers sign contracts for delivery times and penalties. Factors in counting houses keep ledgers in notations that will later harden into more consistent double-entry bookkeeping. Bills of exchange begin to reduce the weight of coin and the dangers of moving it, and with every bounding line written on a page, trust grows and the horizon of ambition lengthens. On the countryside, life continues with small improvements that feel more significant than they appear. Crop rotations are managed more intelligently. Villages expand into thinned forests. Water is controlled in ditches and ponds. Mills multiply and add branches, fulling mills for cloth alongside grain mills for bread. Lords entice settlers to marginal lands with charters promising years of peace. Rent-free work before dues begin, with courts of low jurisdiction that allow more self-management, and with bounded obligations that make migration a calculation rather than a gamble. The climate, in a relatively warmer patch, cooperates more. Often than not, population grows, and with it, the pressure that will turn an epidemic's arrival into a catastrophe no one has prepared to manage. The empire's legal order bears the mark of its plurality. When a case comes to court at a diet, princes handle it by deferring what they cannot resolve and by stabilizing what they can. Land peace proclamations are repeated with local variations. The careful reader notices that what was once rare law becomes a habit. The ban on private feuds is not absolute. It has exceptions and is locally enforced, but it sets an expectation. Immunities are not blank checks. They are framed and sometimes revisited. You witness a style of federation that does not rely on a metaphysical theory. It relies on a willingness to accept summary rules because they make everyone's freight move more reliably. Freight is the music underpinning ritual. When goods can travel, words travel with them. And by degrees, a culture of writing and record replaces a culture of memory in more corners of life by the time you reach the 14th century's threshold. A new king will give this diverse reality a constitutional roof. Charles IV will craft a document that is less an innovation than a better mirror. He will write down how kings are chosen, by whom, and with what ceremonies and guarantees. But before that, the interregnum's echo has taught the players their parts, and it has taught you how to listen to the slow ordering of offices, to the steady writing of statutes, to the negotiation between cities and lords, to the way monasteries become not only prayers but files. As you pause on a bridge whose tollkeeper knows his schedule without looking, you might ask when the rules for choosing a king are finally written into a golden text. Will the words confirm what is already real, or will they pretend to a unity that cannot be willed by decree alone? You enter a hall in Frankfurt where electors gather with measured steps, each carrying a history on his shoulders as tangible as a mantle of fur. The Golden Bull of 1356 is not the thunder from a mountaintop. It is a codex of procedures for an empire that long ago learned the cost of ambiguity. Charles IV has seen what confusion over elections can cost, and he shapes a law that fixes who votes, how they vote, where they meet, and what happens if they do not. 7 electors 3. Archbishops and 4 secular princes are designated as the empire's living ballot box. The choice of cities for ceremonies and the precedence of offices are named with a granularity that tells you what kind of order this is. Not a dream of a single will turned law, but a machine that runs because every gear is lubricated with known rituals. The Golden Bull also reaches into the texture of governance. It confirms privileges, streamlines the expectations around coinage and tolls in electoral lands, and tries to prevent internal wars by making it clearer what counts as rebellion. It makes clear that the great ones are expected to keep peace within their lands because they participate in choosing the man who, in theory, guarantees peace across the whole. You can walk through an electoral territory and notice the consequence. A higher density of officials with titles you begin to recognize burgrave, marshal, chamberlain, linked to a function in law or war. Each cultivated as a hereditary office to give families within territories a stake in continuity. Charles IV himself governs from Prague with a taste for stone and parchment over steel. He builds a city into a capital and a court into a center of art and letters. He attracts scholars and creates a university to feed the need for clerks and judges. The imperial orbit shifts eastward, not as conquest, but as preference. And you sense how flexible the empire is. It can survive a king's focus on a portion because it is built to function without non-stop supervision. The Golden Bull's prose is filled with specifics about banquets, processions, and the carrying of imperial insignia. It is easy to mock as ceremonial fussing until you recall how much heat a lack of procedures can produce. The fuss is preventative medicine. The empire learns that clarity of role is a cheap substitute for armor. Outside the high courts, life changes with a new tempo born of loss. The Black Death arrives in mid-century and takes lives with a speed that empties streets and stalls any talk of progress into a silence filled with bells. The pestilence is not a political event, but it rearranges politics by rearranging labor. Landlords struggle to hold tenants to old obligations. Workers, fewer and more necessary, negotiate better. terms in some regions. Wages rise here, decline there, and always the great system must adapt. Cities become both refuges and hothouses of fear. Violence breaks out against minorities, especially Jews, who are accused by ignorance and hunted by panic. The empires? Courts issue protections sometimes, princes intervene sometimes. Bishops denounce violence sometimes, but the scale of grief outpaces the capacity for order. What you notice, in the long perspective, is how quickly the empire returns to its habits once the waves pass. Markets reopen, tribunals meet, records resume, and statutes are copied as if the world can be remade by office and oath even after. Untimely graves multiplied. In the later 14th century. The Hanseatic League's commerce in the north gives the empire a maritime flank, and the language of privileges now includes sea rights and staple ports. Cities like Lübeck, Hamburg, and Bremen coordinate policies that cross princely frontiers, and their councils speak with a collective voice that statehood will later be jealous of. Meanwhile, inland cities like Nuremberg and Augsburg, perfect. The craft of municipal governance, tax farming, becomes more systematic. Public debt instruments appear. Walls are maintained and extended. Artillery is bought and tested. Guilds become both economic and political, negotiating representation in councils and a manageable pace of innovation in trades. Technology moves quietly. The mechanical clock becomes a symbol of civic pride. Bells ring to a schedule that orders work and prayer. And paper replaces parchment in many offices, accelerating the rate at which copies can be made and preserved. Law becomes the empire's common language in a new way. Roman law, refined in universities and carried by trained jurists, becomes the standard in many territories for dealing with property, contracts, and crimes. Customary law does not vanish. It coexists and sometimes resists. But the dialogue between learned law and local custom produces an elasticity that can absorb diversity without collapsing into contradiction. Courts at territorial and urban levels keep more rigorous dockets. Appeal procedures gain treads so that they can bear the weight of grievance without slipping into feud. A case about the right to fish a stretch of river might begin with testimony about memory, continue with a charter produced from a chest, and conclude with a citation from a glossator's treatise. None of this is dramatic. All of it is civilization. The empire's inability to coerce uniformly becomes, in practice, its genius for channeling forces. It has no standing army worthy of the name. It has instead a capacity to declare norms and convene bodies. When a prince misbehaves egregiously, leagues form, bans are imposed, diets are called, and settlements are hammered together with the sparing use of force as a last resort. When cities grow arrogant, they are sometimes humbled. When princes grow domineering, they are sometimes fenced in. The oscillation between pride and check carves a middle path. It is not the path of a unitary state. It is the path of a federation that prefers repair to replacement. If you are a merchant, you prefer repair. If you are a peasant, you hope for repairs that lower your dues. If you are a prince, you want repairs that preserve your face. Printing arrives in the 15th century and changes the empire's metabolism. Mainz gives birth to movable type, and suddenly statutes, indulgences, sermons, and grammars can be reproduced with a speed that makes control difficult and participation easy. Pamphlets cross boundaries, and literate artisans and merchants expand the public that cares about words. A broadsheet announcing a new city ordinance can be pasted to a door in an afternoon, and the news of it can travel downriver by morning. You can overstate the revolution if you ignore the many who still cannot read. You cannot ignore the new pressure it puts on bishops, councils, and princes to justify decisions in more public terms. By the time the 15th century closes, you can feel the empire preparing to reform itself without abandoning its many centers. The habit of land pieces will be turned into something more permanent. Courts that can claim jurisdiction over the empire's quarrels will be established, and the map will be divided into circles that can act together in raising troops and money. These reforms will not erase the Golden Bull's rituals. They will lean on them. You are left looking at a system that has learned to thrive without a monarch who commands daily obedience. And you may ask, when a new kind of religious dispute arrives, not over who invests whom, but over what the church teaches and how a soul is saved, will this federation of routines stretch to include it? Or will its very tolerance of difference turn into a friction that cannot be negotiated away? You step into a diet at Worms in 1495, where a tall, restless Habsburg named Maximilian looks like a man who would prefer armor to parchment, but has come to love both. He has fought and married his way into a composite of lands. He knows that if the empire is to remain credible, it needs more than memories and mobile courts. He supports a reform that sounds technical and feels monumental: the creation of a permanent high court, the imperial chamber court, where subjects from across the empire can seek justice against powerful men, including their lords, under imperial law. Alongside the court, he supports a general land freedom, a more lasting ban on feuds, and a tax called the common penny that tries to spread the cost of public order across classes. He will be disappointed in many details. The tax is difficult to collect, but the structures endure. And their endurance tells you how ready the empire is to grow new bones. Another reform divides the empire into circles, administrative regions, with poetic names: the Bavarian Circle, the Swabian Circle, the Upper Rhenish, and so forth. Circles are expected to coordinate defense, tax collection, and the enforcement of judgments. They are not mini-states. They are committees with teeth, variable in energy depending on who sits in them and how much danger is near. But they represent a new layer that can be activated without summoning the whole empire. In these bodies you hear a mature federalism: princes, bishops, and cities sitting together to decide how to raise companies of men, how to distribute costs, and how to insist that a ban declared by a court is not an idle curse, but an actionable instruction. The perpetual diet at Regensburg, established effectively after 1663, but anticipated in tone, has its ancestor in this flowering of permanent institutions. The empire likes to keep its talking going. It mistrusts silence because silence lets private force grow. The Imperial Aulic Council in Vienna, a rival court more directly under the emperor, also grows. The two high courts will sometimes compete, sometimes coordinate, and litigants will become skilled in choosing forums. Meanwhile, in territories, rulers develop their own styles of governance, many under the influence of cameralist thinkers, who say in sober prose that a prince's job is to increase the wealth and happiness of his land by careful management of agriculture, trade, and population. Schools for officials appear. Statistics become a tool. Maps improve, and the gentle authoritarianism of ledger books advances. In cities, councils become more professional. Nuremberg's councillors manage a city that is both a manufacturing hub and a center of art, patronizing painters and instrument makers while negotiating with nearby nobles about rights to hunt and graze. Augsburg is a banking giant in embryo, with families who learn to move money across Europe and to finance princes who want to make war without raising taxes too bluntly at home. Guilds protect craft but also resist innovation. Entrepreneurs find ways around rules when demand is loud enough. Public works proliferate. Fountains, hospitals, schools. Latin grammar schools feed universities, and universities feed courts and chanceries with men who can write and calculate. The civic sense itches toward improvement and orderliness. By street and by statute, cities become laboratories for a managerial imagination that will later find other names in the countryside: pressures, mount, and release. After the demographic scythe of the 14th century receded, population growth resumed in the 15th and early 16th. Lords who once recruited settlers with favorable terms now try to reimpose stricter obligations. Enclosure of commons begins in some places. New rents are invented. Dues are recalculated with a zeal that peasants understand as greed. Markets penetrate villages enough that cash becomes necessary where it was once rare. Frustration grows under the surface of a God-fearing steadiness. Preachers in rural pulpits speak to sin and redemption. Gossip circulates faster with printed sheets. Grievances are written down and collected. Memoranda of demands are composed in village halls on evenings when harvest is in and beer is cheap. Then, almost quietly at first, a theological dispute becomes a public event with political consequences. A monk and professor nails a set of theses to a church door in 1517 and invites a debate about the sale of indulgences, the nature of repentance, and the authority of the church to mediate salvation. The ideas would have traveled slowly in an earlier century. They rush now on presses that do not ask permission. Princes and city councils read, preachers repeat. Guild halls murmur. And simple readers take comfort in the notion that grace might be nearer to their acts of faith than they had imagined. The debate is not only about souls, it is about jurisdiction. If a conscience can stand before God with Scripture as its defense, what then of a network of courts and dues justified by a longer chain of mediations? Maximilian dies in 1519. And the election that follows will elevate a Habsburg with a European empire in mind, a ruler who will try to sit on Spain, the Low Countries, Austria, and the empire at once. He will be grand in title and limited in fact, because the empire he inherits is thick with courts and circles that restrain as much as they enable. Meanwhile, the unrest in the countryside will blossom into peasant wars with pamphlets as much as with pikes. Driven by a mixture of religious agitation and material grievance, cities will choose confessions. Princes will declare their territories, aligned with Reformed teachings or clamped to old orthodoxy. And the empire will try to keep the conversation going in diets where tempers run high and pens run faster. As you stand at the threshold where late medieval routine meets early modern argument, the empire's gift and burden come into full relief. It is a machine for turning conflict into casework, an engine that prefers precedent to decree, a federation that can borrow unity for a while and then return it to lockers where it is kept safe for the next crisis. Its people have learned a powerful habit to trust that process, if allowed to work, can lower the heat of even bitter disputes. A reformer's words will test that habit. Prince's ambitions will test it. Markets and faith will tug from opposite sides, you might then ask, as the sound of hammers on type echoes through alleys and a preacher clears his throat in a pulpit. Will the empire's committees and courts prove supple enough to hold a schism inside their routines, or will they teach Europe a different lesson that even a great federation can reach a question whose answer must be written not only in charters, but in wounds? You begin in a room where the debate is polite and the stakes are mortal. A diet convenes in a city whose name will echo through centuries, and inside its halls, princes, envoys, bishops, and city delegates listen as a monk's words are weighed, for their potential to unmake the alliance between doctrine and order. The early 1520s are a sequence of meetings, edicts, and pamphlets. The Edict of Worms will try to declare an end to a spreading debate by prescribing a man and his ideas. The presses do not obey. The empire, built for turning conflicts into law, now faces a quarrel that multiplies in homes and hearths faster than it can be docketed. What matters for you is not only the famous scenes, but the routines that change inside city councils and village churches when theology becomes administration. In reformed cities, councils move cautiously to remake worship. Altars are rearranged. Images are removed or defended depending on the local rhythm. Vernacular preaching replaces Latin sermons. The Mass is reinterpreted. Communion in both kinds is given to laity where it had not been. Schools are reformed to teach catechisms. Poor relief is placed under civic management. Monastic houses are dissolved or redirected to education and care. Clergy marry. Chapter lands are repurposed. Guilds adjust to new feast days and a revised calendar of work and worship. Nothing explodes everywhere at once. Everything changes somewhere every week. Town scribes record new ordinances with a thoroughness that reassures the people who must live under them. Printers churn out primers and polemics in the language people speak, in territories where rulers adopt the new religion. A policy called confessionalization takes shape before it knows its name. Princes shepherd their subjects into unity through church orders that fix teaching, liturgy, and church visitation. Superintendents and consistories replace or supplement old ecclesiastical courts. Pastors are examined for doctrine and morality. Schools are folded into a program where learning serves a clearer catechetical plan. In Catholic territories, reforms in the old church answer with their own standards. Bishops insist on residency. Seminaries begin to train priests more systematically, and catechisms are printed with a fervor matching their rivals. The result across the empire is not an even split but a mosaic, sometimes with Reformed and Catholic towns 5 miles apart, sharing markets and keeping different holy days, managing coexistence through habits of politeness and unsteady truces in the countryside, where the weight of dues matters more than the wording of sermons. The 1520s boil over into peasant revolts that write their grievances in tenets, not merely in curses. Lists of articles are drawn up asking for relief from oppressive labor services, a voice in choosing pastors, fair rents, and fair courts. The rhetoric borrows from the language of Christian freedom, and some cities sympathize while princes grow alarmed. The revolts are crushed with predictably harsh hands where they grow strongest, but not before they reveal how much the empire's new religious debate carries within it the unaddressed pain of old economic arrangements. After the smoke clears, lords reimpose order and, in some places, soften their exactions. Elsewhere, fear makes them tighten their grip. The countryside returns to work because it must. Winter is not a theory. The emperor, whose name is larger than any one land he rules, attempts to preserve a Catholic unity that his other crowns also require. He calls diets, negotiates with leagues, wages campaigns against fronts that shift from the Baltic to the Pyrenees, and tries imperial justice as a solvent for theological stubbornness. The princes of the empire, whose new ability to organize confessions gives them sharper tools, form leagues for protection Schmalkaldic above all and cities, join in calculations that mix faith and commerce. War between emperor and league comes and goes, with victories that do not decide the one question that matters for daily life: how to live together under two kinds of worship, without losing the benefits of trade and peace. Meanwhile, the flow of work resumes under altered signs. Printers turn out Bibles, chorales, polemics, and schoolbooks. Artisans paint over saints' niches or polish them depending on orders. Altarpieces are removed to storerooms or preserved as art rather than devotion. In some places, church music becomes congregational song. In others, the old polyphony is burnished to new beauty. The care of the poor, once a pious duty spread loosely across almsgivers and religious orders, is rationalized into civic funds. Hospitals are reorganized. Orphans are enrolled into apprenticeships as a policy rather than as charity. Different. Confessions converge on the notion that a well-governed household and a literate population make for calmer subjects. Governance takes catechisms seriously as instruments of public order. The line between spiritual and temporal grows in some places too sharp to bear, in others elastic enough to hold. In Reformed polities, the prince becomes a kind of emergency bishop, overseeing the church as part of his duty to the commonwealth. In Catholic territories, bishops relearn their office with a vigor drawn from the council that gathers beyond the empire but changes it deeply. Everywhere, law and administration adapt because they must. Courts must decide who owns a monasteries. Lands now that the monastery is dissolved. Councils must arbitrate between neighbors who tolerate less of one another's feasts. Schools must choose which prayers to teach. These decisions are not theatrical. They are incremental, exhausting, and cumulative. Finally, in the mid-century, a settlement is reached that declares a principle that had already taken shape. Ques regio, ius religio. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555 says that a territory's ruler chooses its confession between two forms, and that subjects who cannot conform may emigrate. The rule is a shield and a limit. It preserves peace by channeling conflict into migration. And paperwork, it fails to protect those whose beliefs do not fit the binary. Above all, Calvinists at first, and it leaves mixed cities to find day-by-day arrangements. Imperial institutions now absorb theology into their routines. Circles plan defense in confessional blocks. Courts hear cases with doctrinal subtexts. Diets add religious clauses to tax debates. The empire proves itself a machine for living with difference, but its gears grind more noisily now. In this new geography of belief, the humble again carry the empire. Villagers walk farther to market because they prefer to trade where the calendar aligns with their conscience. Young men cross borders to apprentice in trades where their faith is welcome. Brides bring different psalters to marriages that the law now recognizes with a more standardized eye. Pastors call roll in catechism classes and report to inspectors. Bishops write visitations with notes on the state of souls and windows. Jurists annotate confessions right alongside property laws. Everything is older than it looks. Everything is newer than anyone expected. And you might ask, as churches settle into patterns that will last for generations, whether a federation that has finally written a method for coexistence can keep its peace when foreign kings discover that confession can serve as a banner for conquest just as easily as a map for neighborliness. You pass into a century where the empire's tolerance hardens into borders, then breaks under the weight of ambitions that exceed its patient structures. After 1555, princes mold their lands into confessional states with a thoroughness that treats belief as policy and policy as belief. Schools become engines of doctrine. Clergy are managed as civil servants. Church visitations double as administrative. Audits the empire maintains its courts and circles. It convenes its diets and keeps its peace where it can. But the lines that run through Germany now connect to lines outside. Dynastic and confessional arcs begin to cross its territories, like trajectories on a star map. Claims made in distant capitals find their battlefields in Franconian valleys and Saxon forests. The pressure builds until it breaks in a small act loaded with large symbols. A defenestration in Prague in 1618 becomes a beginning, a local quarrel. About rights in a kingdom under a Catholic Habsburg king and a Protestant estate becomes a war of claim and counterclaim, joined by outsiders who treat the empire as a field for their own contests. What follows is ruin told too often in numbers that numb the senses. What matters for you is the detail. Harvests trampled by soldiers who cannot live on promises. Villages emptied by flight and conscription. Cities turned inward by fear. Plague following famine like a patient horse. Armies learn logistics as a science. Their quartermasters become as important as their colonels. Soldiers become a system that feeds itself off the land when pay fails. A new kind of commander emerges, adept at financing, recruiting, and provisioning entrepreneurs of war whose contracts with sovereigns make them temporary princes in all but name. Within the empire, the structure bends and does not snap because it was never a single beam. Circles still meet, sometimes under occupation's shadow, sometimes in exile. Courts try to function. Diets convene, stop, and reconvene. Some territories are spared by luck or diplomacy. Others are scoured. Cities that invested in walls and artillery earn their peace by deterring sieges too costly to attempt. Others are rolled over. Confession remains a banner, but past a point, it becomes a costume for power. Catholic France will enter the war against Catholic Habsburgs. Protestant princes will switch sides when survival demands. The empire's federative logic is abused by all parties. Its patience is treated as weakness, its courts as irrelevance. Yet, in the spaces where fighting ebbs, ordinary governance persists with a stubborn professionalism that is both admirable and strange. Notaries continue to copy wills. Baptismal registers fill. Contracts are signed with hands that tremble. Guilds adjust production to military markets. Farmers plant in safer corners. Refugees bring skills to new towns. Pastors bury without, diminishing their word's tenderness. Science visits an army train. Engineers build bridges and fortifications. Maps are drawn with exactitude by men whose lines will later be used to farm and to govern. The empire absorbs this quota of practical knowledge even as it bleeds. When exhaustion finally forces the parties to negotiate, an imperial city becomes a congress. Delegates arrive in Westphalian towns and sit for years, eating, writing, arguing, and performing a dance that only such a federation could sustain. Local rights are balanced. Sweden and France are given satisfactions. The Dutch independence is recognized. The Swiss are quietly released from certain obligations. The peace that emerges in 1648 is less peace than architecture. It affirms the empire as a body of bodies, with members that enjoy a larger scope of sovereignty within and a guarantee against predation from without. It admits Calvinists to the Augsburg formula. It confirms that confessional maps can be drawn, and redrawn with an eye to minimizing mixed parishes, not because mixing is evil, but because administration likes clarity. The consequences unfold over decades. Princes refine their states. Standing armies in miniature appear in many lands. Fiscal offices expand. Cameralism spreads as a recipe book for wealth. Cities recover, and, in some, commerce explodes. Banking families finance reconstruction. Manufacturers in textiles and metalware set standards that draw students and money. Peasants rebuild cautiously. Landlords experiment with better rotations. Potatoes eventually move into fields, changing the geometry of survival. Churches of both. Confessions adapt to lower heat. Truce breeds a practical ecumenism in villages, where pastors know one another's names and disputes are settled by rotation of worship spaces rather than by accusations. The empire's courts, especially the imperial chamber court, fill with cases that refine property rights, inheritance, and jurisdiction with a sharpness that will later be admired by jurists of unitary states who forget how they learned there. Craft foreign powers continue to test the empire's land as an arena for their rivalries. But the settlement has taught Europeans a habit of Congress. Disputes are now often framed as solvable by talks in towns rather than by declarations in capitals. The empire's inability to force a result becomes Europe's salvation. It models a technique of compromise that assumes permanence of difference and works to manage it rather than erase it. This technique will be tested again and again with mixed results. But the rooms where it was learned are inside the empire cities, where people discovered that food arrives more reliably in a regime that writes its temper into articles rather than screams it into banners. As the century turns, the empire settles into a long age of administration whose virtues are plotting and whose vices are inertia. Princes cultivate gardens and museums, build roads and schools, drill their small armies, and dream of small expansions that can be obtained by marriages or boundary adjustments. Cities enforce building codes and clean streets. Guilds negotiate with councils about admitting more hands. Jews occupy legal niches that vary by territory. Students move among universities whose curricula are surprisingly alike. Theological heat cools into pedantry or into devotions more private than incendiary. If you listen, you can still hear the deep hum of federative life, like a mill in the distance. The wheels turn, the flour is ground, bread is baked. The peace that made Europe carries a thought native to the empire, that sovereignty can be layered, that rights can be differentiated, that allegiance can be multiple, and that such complexity is not a disease, but a shield. You may now ask, as a new century warms up with ideas of reason and markets, whether a federation designed to contain princes will be able to contain peoples who begin to imagine themselves as nations with a single will and a single flag, and whether the same law that kept swords sheathed can keep drums silent. When a different kind of music begins to play, you walk into the 18th century and find that the empire has become a schoolhouse with many classrooms. Enlightenment ideas travel into courts and councils. Cameralists advise princes to count, to measure, to encourage industry, to reform serfdom without causing revolt. The perpetual diet at Regensburg becomes the empire's low, continuous voice, issuing decisions that add inches to the law rather than feet. The emperor's court in Vienna grows into an efficient Habsburg machine. The Hohenzollerns in Brandenburg, Prussia, build a military organ administrative state on sandy soil. The Elector of Saxony courts art and industry. Countless smaller rulers play their own variations on a theme. To be modern is to be organized. Territories improve roads and canals. Postal services stitch the map. State monopolies and privileges spur or restrain industries depending on the prince's imagination. Taxation becomes more rational. Counting improves. Censuses count people in columns that later historians will read with gratitude. Agricultural reform works slowly. Three-field systems shift toward new rotations centered on fodder and tubers. Livestock improves. Rural manufactures multiply where land cannot feed all mouths. Cities expand and beautify. Public theaters and coffee houses appear. The press probes authority discreetly. Religious life becomes a mixture. In some lands, toleration spreads by edict. In others, conformity is softened by habit rather than by law. Beneath this surface, the empire's constitution continues to serve as a referee. The imperial chamber court, sometimes ridiculed for slowness, nevertheless keeps lords mindful that expropriation and arbitrary power can be challenged in a venue whose verdict matters. Small lordships survive because the law protects them. Cities keep their autonomy because a web of customs would be costly to tear apart. There is frustration in this. Reformers lament how hard it is to change anything quickly. Utopians dream of a simple map with fewer colors. But there is safety, too. Minorities, heirs in complex successions, and border communities find that their lives are less likely to be crushed by a single wave because the shoreline is crinkled with coves. Large wars still visit. The War of the Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War drag armies across the empire's fields. Prussia asserts itself with a will that rattles shelves in many chanceries. Bavaria and Saxony adjust to humiliations with a mixture of fortitude and opportunism. Civilians suffer, soldiers billet. Supplies are requisitioned. Disease follows. Yet after each storm, the empire's routines resume. The habit of not making total war on neighbors within the Constitution remains. The sophistication of soldiering increases. The professionalism of supply leaves behind a culture of counting that migrates into peacetime offices. The empire, even in war, teaches moderation by the messy virtue of its plurality.